It began on an ordinary street corner in a quiet American town where an elderly man in a worn military coat was struck down in broad daylight, and no one spoke up. But what happened next would shake the silence, reveal hidden legacies, and force a town to confront what it means to truly see someone. Don't forget to subscribe before we begin today's powerful story. The air in Millstone, Kentucky smelled faintly of old bricks and fresh bread that morning. Harold Mays, 83 years old, shuffled out of the corner grocery with a small brown paper bag nestled in his left arm. Inside it, a loaf of rye, a box of throat lozenges, and a glossy postcard with a picture of the Appalachian Hills. He planned to send it to his grandson, a cadet at the Naval Academy. Harold still wrote letters. His hands shook, but the words always came out steady. His coat hung loose over his shoulders, olive green, military issue, patched at the elbow and fraying at the cuffs. On the chest, a faded rectangular imprint where his name tag used to be. A relic. Like him. Some people in town called him Cap out of habit, but most folks just let him pass without a word. He didn't mind. He wasn't walking for attention. He walked because he still could. Across the street, outside a roadside bar called the Tin Tankard, a group of bikers leaned against their shining machines, laughing over cheap beers and loud stories. Their engines were silent for once, but the chrome gleamed like it was ready to pounce. Harold didn't glance their way. He had seen louder men in far darker places. As he moved down the sidewalk, his coat brushed the handlebar of one of the motorcycles. The bike wobbled slightly, didn't tip, just rocked. Harold stopped at once. He turned slowly, both hands raised in habit, the paper bag pressing into his chest. Didn't mean to touch it. "Son," he said, his voice sandpapered with age. "Guess the coat's thicker than I remembered." He offered a small, apologetic smile, but one of the bikers, tall, tattooed, with mirrored sunglasses that reflected nothing but himself, stepped forward. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check the bike. He raised a hand and slapped Harold across the face. Hard. The crack echoed off brick walls. Harold crumpled to the sidewalk with a grunt, the bag tearing as he hit the ground. The bread rolled into the gutter, dust gathering along its edges. Inside the bar, nobody moved. A man took a slow sip of beer. Someone chuckled. The others just watched. Harold didn't cry out. He sat up slowly, one knee trembling as he picked up the bread with both hands, brushing off dirt that wouldn't come off. His mouth bled slightly at the corner, but he wiped it with the edge of his sleeve and said nothing. He limped over to the nearest bench, gripping a metal pole for balance. His cane had rolled a few feet away, ignored like him. With a groan, he retrieved it, lowered himself to the bench, and sat still. He didn't look at the man who struck him. He didn't even look at the crowd. He looked at the torn bag in his lap, as if it held something worth saving. And no one, not one person, offered him a hand. Harold kept his eyes on the torn paper bag, as if the loaf of bread and postcard inside could somehow make the day right again. His hands rested gently in his lap, trembling slightly. Not from pain, but from something deeper, something colder. The sting on his cheek had already begun to fade, but the weight in his chest had not. Behind him, laughter drifted out from the Tin Tankard. Around him, the street resumed its usual rhythm, indifferent to the man who'd been struck for daring to exist. He didn't curse. He didn't call out. Instead, Harold leaned back against the chilled slats of the metal bench and closed his eyes. Not in sleep, no. He was wide awake. But sometimes, when he closed his eyes, the past visited with more clarity than the present ever offered. The smell of motor oil in the gutter sent him back to 1953, to the edge of a supply road just outside Munsan. The air then was choked with smoke, and the snow on the ground was always redder than it should have been. His buddy of Frankie Bell had gone down with a piece of shrapnel in his gut, screaming about home while Harold yanked him out of the burning Jeep with nothing but adrenaline and a broken boot sole. No one gave medals for that, not really. You just remembered it in moments like this, when the world made you feel small and unseen. A gust of wind snapped Harold back to the present. The bag in his lap rustled. His fingers twitched. He reached into his coat pocket, deep and threadbare, and pulled out an old flip phone. It was scratched, scuffed, and years past its prime, but Harold had kept it charged, always. Not for idle calls, not for chatting. It had one number stored, labeled simply Lion 1, emergency only. His thumb hovered over the button. He didn't want revenge. That wasn't his style. He didn't need justice in a courtroom or apologies shouted over digital noise. What he wanted, what he needed was for someone to know. Someone who remembered who he was before the world forgot. He pressed the button. No one nearby noticed. Not the waitress at the diner. Not the teenager on the skateboard. Not the man walking his dog. No one saw the old man on the bench make a quiet call to something most of them couldn't imagine still existed. Harold didn't lift the phone to his ear. He simply let it ring once, then shut it. That was enough. That was the signal. Then he waited. He didn't shift, didn't twitch. He sat as still as a sculpture. Time passed. Maybe 15 minutes. Maybe more. The wind picked up, tousling the collar of his coat and setting tiny dust devils loose along the curb. The bar crowd had thinned, the bikers moving back inside, probably to boast about how they'd taught some geezer a lesson. Then came the sound. It began as a faint pulse, deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat hidden beneath concrete, a low vibration in the soles of shoes, the kind of noise that cities forget how to process because it doesn't come from trains or traffic. A few heads turned. From beyond the tree line at the far edge of town, a dark speck approached the sky. Fast, low. The sound swelled into a deafening thrum unmistakable to anyone who had ever served. Rotors, not a news chopper, not a traffic eye. This was military, and it was descending. People began stepping out of shops, shielding their eyes. A waiter dropped a tray of glasses. The bartender walked to the doorway, squinting upward. "That's not a truck," someone muttered. No, it wasn't. It was a Black Hawk helicopter, matte black and sleek, cutting through the clouds like judgment. It hovered over Main Street for just a moment before banking sharply and descending into an empty patch of grass behind the row of stores. The air screamed with the force of its blades. Dust and paper whipped down the street. Then came the second arrival, a black SUV, heavily armored, tires screeching as it came to a halt in front of the tin tankard. Its doors opened in unison. Boots hit pavement. 12 men stepped out, each clad in tactical gear, their movements smooth and synchronized. No one raised a weapon. No one barked commands. But they didn't need to. Their presence said everything practiced, precise, unwavering. From the helicopter, a single figure disembarked and strode down the alley between the buildings with purposeful grace. Broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, mid-50s, with eyes like tempered steel. He wore no helmet, no sunglasses, just a dark jacket with a patch that read U.S. Army Special Operations. The kind of man who didn't need to speak to be understood. He walked straight toward the bench. Harold looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, nothing passed between them but memory. The man knelt, gently brushing a spot of dried blood from Harold's cheek with the edge of his sleeve. "Dad," he said, voice low and calm, "I got here as fast as I could." Harold gave a small nod. That was all. Inside the bar, the music had stopped. Someone peeked out from behind the blinds. Another ducked below the bar counter, phone in hand but forgotten. The street, once full of noise and indifference, now fell into the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. The biker who had slapped Harold earlier stepped out into the sunlight, beer still in hand, mid-laugh until he saw the man kneeling beside the old veteran, until he saw the soldiers, until he saw the patch. And then, just like that, the smirk died on his lips, because this wasn't just an old man in a coat anymore. This was someone's father. And that someone had just landed a Black Hawk in the middle of town. The biker's grin vanished the moment he recognized the man kneeling beside the old veteran. the one he had mocked, shoved aside with a slap that was supposed to make people laugh. But no one was laughing now. The street was still unnaturally so. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones lowered. Footsteps slowed. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it in the pit of their stomachs. Colonel Matthew Mays rose from his kneel with calm precision, like a man whose body no longer remembered fear. His movements were measured, silent, not stiff, but deliberate, like someone who had spent his life commanding respect without needing to demand it. He turned and faced the street. Behind him, his men fanned out in a fluid arc, forming a silent semicircle that closed off the front of the tin tankard. No words were spoken, no weapons drawn, but the air felt thick like a storm had settled in and was waiting for the first wrong move to break loose. Matthew's gaze found the group of bikers. They stood frozen on the porch, leather jackets tight around their chests, beer bottles half lifted, caught somewhere between bravado and disbelief. The tallest of them, the one who had struck Harold, held his ground the longest. He took a sip from his bottle, slow and defiant, though the trembling in his fingers betrayed him. Matthew took a single step forward. "Which one of you," he said, his voice firm and steady, "struck a veteran?" The question wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It came out quiet as gravel under boots but landed like a hammer. The biker group shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, others lowering their drinks. No one answered. At first, then the man Troy stepped forward, hands half raised in mock surrender. "Look, man," he said, trying to muster a smirk. "It was just some old guy. He bumped my ride. No harm done." Matthew didn't blink. He didn't flinch. That old guy served this country while you were still learning how to spell your own name. A low ripple passed through the crowd. Somewhere across the street, someone whispered. "Damn," Troy scoffed, trying to hang on to his fading arrogance. "You military types think you can just drop in and bark orders like you own the place?" Matthew took one more step. Just one, but it erased the distance between tolerance and action. "I didn't come here to bark orders," he said, voice calm as a distant thunderclap. "I came here because my father bled on a sidewalk while cowards stood around laughing." He didn't look at the bar crowd. He didn't need to. Their silence said enough. He turned slightly and raised one finger. One of his soldiers nodded and stepped back, pressing two fingers to the radio on his shoulder. No more than 90 seconds later, a police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing blue and white, but no sirens. The kind of quiet arrival that suggested someone had warned them in advance not to play this like a routine stop. The officer stepped out, not with casual indifference, but with cautious, deliberate steps. They looked not at Troy first, but at Matthew. They recognized the weight of the moment, and they understood. Matthew pointed. "That one." Troy's expression shifted from swagger to pale confusion. "Wait, what, are you serious?" Neither the soldiers nor the officers responded. One officer pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Troy didn't run. He didn't fight, because he already knew it was over. His defiance dissolved, as thin and cheap as the beer still clutched in his hand. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The sound rang louder than the slap ever had. As the officers led him away, the street remained silent. It wasn't fear that kept them quiet, it was shame. For watching, for doing nothing, for the laughter they didn't stop. Even the jukebox inside the bar, which had been playing an old Leonard Skynyrd tune, now sat in embarrassed silence. Matthew turned back to Harold, who hadn't moved from the bench. The old man was sitting straighter now, as if something heavy had been lifted from his shoulders, though his face remained unreadable. Weathered, calm, Matthew crouched again to meet his father's eyes. "You okay?" Harold didn't answer immediately. Then he gave a faint nod and something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "I've had worse," he said hoarsely, but not in front of so many people who did nothing. The words didn't accuse, they revealed, and the weight of them lingered. A woman with gray streaks in her hair stepped forward from the edge of the sidewalk. She kept her head low, but her hands held a folded white handkerchief. She approached Harold slowly, stopping just before the bench. I I should have said something, she whispered. I'm sorry. Harold looked up at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he accepted the handkerchief, nodded gently, and looked away. That tiny gesture was all it took. A young man near the coffee shop took off his baseball cap. A father lifted his child onto his shoulders and pointed toward the bench. A boy, no older than 10, stood rigidly at attention and saluted awkwardly, but with full sincerity. From across the street, a middle-aged man in flannel, retired Navy, stood tall and straight, joining the silent vigil. Then another man, former Air Force, walked beside him. Soon, they formed a quiet line, shoulder to shoulder. Veterans who had come out of nowhere and said everything without saying a word. Matthew stepped back. He didn't command the moment. He let it happen. His soldiers remained still, watching not with superiority, but with respect, because they understood this wasn't their moment. This was Harold's. The man who had refused to raise his voice. The man who had refused to fall alone. And now, finally, someone was standing beside him. The line of veterans remained shoulder to shoulder for several minutes, their silence more powerful than any anthem. Behind them, Harold sat motionless on the bench, the handkerchief still crumpled loosely in his hand. He didn't raise it. He didn't wave. He simply stared ahead, as if trying to understand what had shifted not just around him, but within the town itself. When the police cruiser finally drove off with Troy inside, the crowd didn't scatter. They lingered. Some stepped forward hesitantly. A woman from the diner brought out a cup of hot coffee and set it gently beside Harold without a word. A teenage boy who'd been filming lowered his phone and pressed it to his chest, eyes wide with something between guilt and reverence. A little girl, no older than 6, tugged at her mother's hand and asked if they could go help the grandpa. Something had broken open in Millstone. Not loudly, but unmistakably. The next morning, the video made its way to the internet. No flashy music, no narration, just raw, steady footage from a dozen phones, different angles. Same story. An old man struck, a street silence. The sudden arrival of a Black Hawk and a man in uniform kneeling before his father. The moment the cuffs clicked, the boy's salute, the clip spread like wildfire. By noon, it had been shared on local news channels. By dusk, it was on national ones. Headlines avoided sensationalism. They didn't need to dramatize what was already real. The story wrote itself: veteran struck in public town watches until his son arrives. Within 24 hours, the mayor of Millstone placed a call to Colonel Mays, not for comment, for permission. We'd like to do something for your father, the mayor said, voice uncertain. A formal recognition, a ceremony, perhaps, but only if he's willing. Matthew didn't hesitate. If it's for him, not for the cameras, he'll come. And so, the planning began. The town green, a modest park nestled between the courthouse and the library, was transformed in less than a week. City workers erected a temporary stage. Folding chairs lined the lawn. Students from the local middle school practiced the national anthem. Volunteers painted signs that simply read, "Thank you, Sergeant Mays." Harold hadn't asked for any of it. In truth, he hadn't even wanted it. But when his grandson called from the academy, voice trembling with pride, Harold agreed. He didn't do it for the spotlight. He did it because, for the first time in years, someone had asked him to be seen. He arrived on the day of the ceremony in a wheelchair, not because he was too weak to walk, but because someone finally offered to push him, and for once, he allowed it. He wore the same olive coat, newly cleaned, a fresh white shirt beneath it. On his lap rested the same cane and the same hands that had once tightened bolts on tanks under enemy fire. The crowd stood as he approached, not out of obligation, but from something deeper, a recognition. Long overdue. The mayor gave a short speech, careful with his words. He acknowledged the silence that had followed the slap, and the silence that had followed the awakening. "This is not just a day to thank one man," the mayor said. "This is a day to admit we almost didn't, and that we still can." But what people remembered most wasn't the mayor. It was Matthew. When the colonel stepped to the podium, dressed not in his uniform but in a simple gray suit, the crowd hushed as if the air itself was waiting. "My father never asked for honor," he began. "He never asked for attention. He didn't need to. His life spoke louder than anything Fisk could say." He turned to where Harold sat, then paused. His voice caught slightly, but he didn't hide it. "You taught me what strength looks like, Dad, and now finally the world knows it too." He stepped down from the stage and took his father's hand. Harold didn't speak. He didn't need to. He raised one hand in acknowledgement, firm, slow, deliberate. The ovation that followed lasted nearly 4 minutes, not for medals, not for revenge, but for every quiet act of service that had gone unnoticed, for every battle fought after the war ended, for every Thursday walk that had meant more than anyone realized. In the days that followed, the change in Millstone wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The corner where Harold had been struck was no longer just a patch of sidewalk. It was a place people paused. Someone painted a small yellow line across the edge of the curb with the words, "We remember." The bench where he'd sat was cleaned and revarnished by a group of high schoolers. They left a note underneath the seat, "For those who stood before we saw." And something else began happening too quietly, gently. Veterans began to speak. Men and women who had sat at the edges of church meetings and town halls started sharing stories. A woman who had served in Desert Storm stood up at a PTA meeting and spoke of the loneliness she felt wearing a uniform in a town that had forgotten. A former medic from Afghanistan started a support group at the library. Harold didn't lead any of it, but he was at every meeting. He sat in the back. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he said nothing. But his presence alone said everything. And for the first time in a long time, people started waving to him first. They didn't do it out of pity. They did it out of recognition. Out of an understanding that what had once looked like an old man in a faded coat was something more. A living reminder. A quiet shield. The town hadn't just seen Harold. It had begun to see itself. The town had begun to see itself. And in doing so, it had started to change, not just in public ceremonies or painted sidewalks, but in quieter places too. It changed in the way people spoke to one another, in how they paused before judging, in how they began to ask questions they once ignored. But perhaps the most unexpected transformation came not from the crowd, nor from the mayor's office, but from a man no one expected to hear from again. 1 week after the ceremony on the town green, Harold received a letter in the mail. The envelope was unremarkable, no return address, the handwriting uneven, almost unsure. Inside was a single slip of paper, folded once down the middle. No long explanation, no excuses. Just 6 words written in shaky block letters. "If you'll meet me, I'll listen." It was signed only, Troy. Harold stared at the note for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't fold it again. He simply held it between his fingers, as though feeling the weight of something more than paper. He could have thrown it away. No one would have blamed him. Not his son, not the veterans, not a soul in Millstone. But Harold didn't believe in throwing things away, not bread, not memories, and certainly not people, at least not when they were still reaching. He made a call. 3 days later, just before Troy's scheduled court hearing, a private meeting was arranged in a back room of the Millstone courthouse. The space was plain and quiet. No cameras, no uniforms, just a small wooden table, 2 chairs, and the sound of old pipes ticking behind the walls. Troy arrived first. He was different. Not in a dramatic way, but in posture. Gone were the sunglasses, the leather vest, the sneer that tried to make up for whatever was broken underneath. He wore a button-down shirt that didn't quite fit. His hair had been cut short, maybe for court, maybe for dignity. His hands, folded in front of him, trembled ever so slightly as he sat waiting. When Harold entered, he didn't speak. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply walked to the other chair and sat down across from Troy, his eyes calm but unwavering, the way they used to be when he faced busted engines and battlefield triage. For a long while, neither man said anything. Troy cleared his throat. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered, voice low, cracking at the edges. Harold didn't blink. "That's the problem," he replied gently. "You didn't care." The words weren't thrown like punches. They were placed, carefully and without heat, like a mechanic laying tools on a bench. Truth without vengeance. Troy looked down at his hands, ashamed. "My dad was a soldier," he said finally. "Vietnam. Came back. Different. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't talk. Drank a lot. I used to hate the sound of boots in the hallway. Thought the uniform took him from me." Harold nodded slowly. "I knew men like that. Some came back, but not all of them made it home." "Not really." Troy swallowed hard. "I guess I carried all that hate around. Thought if I could scare people, be the loudest guy in the room, I'd feel something. But I didn't. And then that day, I saw you, and it was like my father. That coat, that calm. I don't know what happened. You didn't see me," Harold said. "You saw your anger. I was just standing where it landed." A pause stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Troy reached into his pocket and slid a folded form across the table. "Judge's orders said I could start therapy, but I didn't want to just sit in a room and talk, so I signed up to volunteer at the VA downtown. I've got 2 uncles there. Figured maybe I could be useful instead of dangerous." Harold looked at the paper, then at the young man who had once knocked him to the pavement without a second thought. Troy's eyes were bloodshot, but they stayed steady. "You won't earn it fast," Harold said finally, voice as quiet as ever. "But every day you show up, you'll get closer." Troy's eyes welled, and for the first time since the slap, he let the weight fall. Tears ran freely down his face as he nodded, unable to speak. Harold reached across the table, placed one weathered hand over Troy's, and gave it the lightest squeeze. No ceremony, no headlines. Just 2 men, both haunted in different ways, finding something neither expected recognition. That meeting would never be reported on the news. There were no medals handed out, no photos, no applause. But it shifted something inside both men, and eventually beyond that quiet room, because Troy didn't vanish after that. He didn't just disappear into a court-mandated program or community service hours. He began showing up twice a week at the VA clinic, then more often at the Veterans Diner, where he helped bus tables and refill coffee for people who once wouldn't have given him a second glance. He drove older vets to their appointments. He helped one amputee fix a porch step. He painted the door of a widow's garage in silence, wiping his hands on his jeans like he was scrubbing off the past. He never boasted. He never posted a single picture, but Harold saw him, sometimes from across the street, sometimes at a distance, sometimes close enough to nod in shared understanding. They didn't talk often, but when they did, it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about groceries, about service dogs, about getting a better wrench for the repair closet at the VA, and once, about forgiveness. "Do you think people like me deserve it?" Troy had asked, stacking chairs after a community event. Harold had looked up from his cane, eyes twinkling behind a veil of age. "Not at first," he said, "but forgiveness isn't given to the deserving. It's given to the trying." Troy nodded, not as a man who had been redeemed, but as one still walking the long road toward it, one step at a time. Troy nodded, not as a man who had been redeemed, but as one still walking the long road toward it, one step at a time. And Harold, never one for long speeches or outward displays, simply returned to his quiet life, content to watch from a distance as others began to carry a weight he had shouldered alone for far too long. 6 months later, the corner behind the tin tankard bar no longer looked like it once had. What had once been a patch of overgrown grass and broken concrete was now neatly trimmed and respectfully quiet. A small bronze plaque had been mounted to a polished stone pedestal at the center of the newly renamed Maze Park. It bore no grand statue, no towering flagpole, just a few simple words etched in clean, bold lettering. In honor of Sergeant Harold Mays, a quiet shield between us and chaos. And beneath it, in smaller letters he never asked to be seen, he simply stood. People stopped there now. Not everyone. Not every time. But enough. Students passed by on their way to school and slowed their pace, sometimes tracing the letters with their fingers. A retired teacher brought her grandchildren every other Sunday to read the plaque aloud. A young artist painted Harold's silhouette onto a nearby brick wall, his profile, half in shadow, half in morning light, with the outline of a cane in one hand and the sky behind him. No one commissioned it. No one asked for approval, but no one painted over it either. The Thursdays never changed for Harold. He still walked to the same diner, still wore the same olive coat with the faded tag, but something had shifted in how the world met him. Teenagers on skateboards nodded respectfully. A new recruit, home on leave, stepped aside on the sidewalk and quietly shook his hand. A father lifted his son onto his shoulders and pointed, saying only, "That's someone who did it right." Harold never responded to those gestures with more than a nod. He didn't want attention, but he appreciated the acknowledgement. It wasn't glory he craved, it was dignity, and now, finally, he carried that dignity without having to defend it. Troy became a regular fixture at the VA clinic. He didn't wear a name tag. He didn't want credit. Twice a week, he drove a beat-up station wagon that rattled over every bump in the road. He helped veterans in and out of wheelchairs, carried groceries to porches, and sat quietly with those who didn't want to talk, but didn't want to be alone either. He was there when no one else could be, and he didn't announce it. Sometimes Harold saw him at the diner, helping a frail man into a booth, laying napkins down with careful hands. They rarely spoke in public, but when their eyes met, they exchanged a subtle nod, one that said more than words could. It was not a bond of friendship exactly, but of shared understanding, built on the hard-earned ground of repentance and forgiveness. One afternoon, Matthew returned to Millstone. It had been months since the ceremony, and he came with no press, no security detail, just himself, dressed in plain clothes, looking older than the last time he stood at a podium. He didn't call ahead. He didn't knock. He simply appeared beside his father at the same bench where everything had begun. They sat in silence for a long time. The town had grown quieter, somehow more aware of itself, and Harold's presence had become not just accepted, but valued. As they watched children play tag beneath the mural of Harold's silhouette, Matthew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You changed this place," he said quietly. Harold didn't reply at first. He tilted his head as a boy, no older than 7, tied a tiny American flag to the back of his bicycle, and then rode off through the park, the fabric fluttering behind him. "Maybe," Harold said after a long pause, "or maybe they just remembered what mattered." Matthew smiled and leaned back. He didn't press. He didn't try to define it. Sometimes change wasn't about sweeping reform or viral videos. Sometimes it was just one person refusing to fall alone, and that refusal echoing outward. As the sun dipped behind the courthouse, the shadows stretched across the park. The words on the plaque caught the golden light, casting long reflections on the grass. Harold stood slowly, gripping his cane. Matthew rose too, instinctively offering an arm, but his father waved him off gently. Harold didn't mind the help, he just wanted to do this part himself. They walked together for a while, not speaking, just listening to the soft noise of the town that had once looked away and now looked differently. That night, as the wind picked up through the trees, some said they could hear a low humming in the distance, not quite mechanical, not quite imagined, the kind of sound you only noticed if you'd been there, if you remembered. It wasn't the rotors of a Black Hawk anymore. It was something quieter, a town breathing again, a place remembering the man who stood still when it mattered most. And Harold, ever the mechanic, ever the father, ever the soldier, Never asked to be the reason, but now he was.